Thanks for watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hi, welcome. Welcome to Points of View live on Teachers Talk Radio this morning, where we've got a wonderful show, bringing you part 3 of our sort of trilogy of shows looking at the Mossbourne Safeguarding Review and the implications from it, the reaction to it across the education sector. Yesterday, we had an interview with Jim Gamble, who was involved in the process of the Safeguarding Review. And today we're joined by edublogger and teacher Andrew Old. Andrew, how are you this morning?
I'm good, thanks.
Excellent. And we've also got our regular panelist on Points of View, Yasmin Omar. How are you doing, Yasmin?
Good, thank you, Tom. How are you?
Now, Yasmin, I've got an important question before we crack on with this. This is if anybody is a regular watcher of Points of View, you'll know this question I'm going to ask Yasmin, but how is your cancellation of Coca-Cola in your life going? Are you still holding out strong?
Yeah, I am. I've even got a sobriety app to help me, actually. I think it's been about 6 weeks now. And yeah, life is just so much better.
Do you know what you're missing out on though?
What, a Diet Coke?
No, this is what I got in the shop.
Oh, wow.
It's for free. It's a limited edition plate based on how many Cokes I've bought.
Oh, yeah, I was about to say for free. Is it because they know that you're like a regular, like an addict?
No, I had no idea. They just gave me it. So anyway, that was important to clear up. But anyway, on to the more serious stuff now. Obviously, we have been discussing the Mossbourne Safeguarding Review. We've got Andrew here to discuss it. Now, Andrew, I wanted to start off. Obviously, you may have seen the interview we did yesterday with Jim Gamble. Now, he was quite sort of. I don't want to sort of speak for him. He seemed quite upset, angry about some of the stuff that you've written in your blog and other people have written in their blogs about the Safeguarding Review, questioning its validity. So I wondered if maybe we start off with, what is fundamentally wrong with this review, in your view?
I mean, I think the biggest issue is that this is not how schools are held to account, that there are existing procedures to be used to follow complaints, and this is quite an innovative way. It's not normally the case that a safeguarding partnership would be commenting on behaviour policy. And I think that's probably the biggest issue. And then on top of that, the procedure used is not one designed for holding people to account or investigating wrongdoing. There are the local child safeguarding practice reviews. Other local authorities and other safeguarding partnerships have on their website, this is not an investigation, this is not an inquiry. It's instead meant to be something that is used after something serious has happened and is known to have happened, like the death of a child or a teacher being convicted of sex offences. And it is used for those involved in safeguarding to learn lessons from that. It's a very innovative use of the safeguarding procedures in a way that just doesn't seem to fit with anything that's ever happened before.
I mean, when I was talking to Jim yesterday, we went through the sort of the provisos as to why this report had been acted upon and done. And, you know, I did ask him about the thresholds and, you know, what was the you know, where was it that the threshold sat? His argument obviously was, and those that wrote the report, and it was a unanimous thing. I mean, he said that yesterday, Andrew. I don't know if you saw it, but he was saying
I
that
did see it.
It was a unanimous decision by 20 people, I think he said, to go ahead with this. It wasn't just one particular team. I think he said that various stakeholders were involved. And the other thing he said was, when looking at the sort of list of, I think there were 4 elements, which I'd have to get on my screen in a second, but there were 4 elements that they looked at, and they deemed it to be serious enough for them to launch this investigation. I think one of the examples he also gave was, he was basically saying, again, I don't want to paraphrase him, but he was saying yesterday that he sort of he wasn't necessarily, you know, set on doing this review, but the school's action and sort of refusing to hand over information or delaying things sort of led him down that path. Or maybe not led him down the path was already set, but maybe it sort of was another thing that added to the evidence that he already felt he had. Does that make a difference in terms of how the school...
I mean, the trouble with saying, well, if the school behave like that, they must be at fault, therefore it's okay to use an irregular procedure against them, is it confuses the order of events. The school reacted as I think almost anyone would if they were subjected to an unfair procedure. The school, yes, they did delay things, mainly, I think, by going through lawyers, but they went through lawyers when they were suddenly subject to this process that seems completely unprecedented, which didn't allow them to answer every single allegation against them. And as I say, I think their attempts to demand due process are being interpreted as a sign of guilt, and that's, you know, that's in itself a violation of due process. I'm also, some of the things that have been complained about seem very selective. I'd love to know just how many things they were subjected to that they had very reasoned, very careful grounds to object to that just weren't mentioned in the report. Instead, we have like comments about how long it took to get them all the behaviour information off the Sims database. And, you know, if you've ever accidentally run too big a report on a Sims database, it's not a trivial matter to organise. And combined with the fact that everything had to go through a lawyer, because I think they rightly perceived that they could incriminate themselves or at least end up condemned by cooperating without legal protection.
Was that the reason though that there was delays in? So for example, when they requested the sanctions lists and the sort of you know, how many people have been removed from classrooms, sanctions awarded, you know, that took, I think Jim said 8 or 9 months. I mean, they asked
for the entire behaviour log, and then when it was, which in itself, you have to wonder, is there a procedure for exporting that? But eventually they did, not eventually, in the short term, they sent them a PDF of every single part of it. And then they got a complaint, well, that's too big a PDF. Can you do something else? I don't know, I'm not there to know what happened in that conversation, but it did not look like there was a procedure in place for accessing the entire behaviour log for over 2 years and share it with an outside party that conventionally wouldn't be inspecting a school.
I mean, again, I'm just sort of saying what Jim said yesterday, really, from his point of view. He was saying that there were lots of delays. He also said a story in that interview whereby he'd gone into the school and he'd been shown around, he talked to the CEO and the principal, and then he'd left the school, and then a teacher at the school showed him an email from the school saying, make sure there's no children sitting on desks outside the classrooms when these guys come in. And I think that was one of the reasons Jim said, well, you know, this sort of shows that they've got something to hide, and therefore we need to do it that way, you know.
I think he just raised that as context, though. I think he was talking about all the different factors that were kind of playing into each other at the same time. Like, I think he said he had a meeting with the school. I think by that point the review hadn't been decided, I think, at that point.
No.
But like, I think the delay, I think that was mentioned because when I read the report, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that it said it was outside of the time frame that they'd wanted to do it in, I think. And I think they said that was due to how long it took to get the information. But then I think Jim at the same time was talking about how, like, he went to visit the school. I think he said, did he say his interactions there that day was positive? Like, he didn't really have much to comment on that.
No, he did. He said that the children were good, and
then he was getting emails. So, like, I don't know. It sounds like there were people working there who were also sending him. I mean, he didn't clarify the time frame as to when he heard from, when he got an email, but I think he said after he met with the school, I think it was the same day or just like immediately after that he heard from a teacher. And I'm not sure if he means a teacher that was actually there at the time or one that had left, but a teacher had said that they'd received an email. So I'm assuming someone who works there, but that they'd got.
I also think that when you consider how schools tend to behave around visitors, it's not as incriminating as it sounds. I mean, if every school that made something less visible during an Ofsted inspection, or when it had a famous visitor, was subject to a safeguarding review, I think every school in the country would be at risk. I mean, he's saying that as though it was something really sinister being hidden, but if you're familiar with schools, I think putting on your best face when you're being visited is not unusual, let alone evidence of a serious safeguarding problem. You've got to remember, this is meant to be dealing with serious safeguarding problems. So we could have lots of criticisms of the school and still wonder, how has it reached the threshold where it's been dealt with as a serious incident?
I mean, that's something that, you know, we sort of focused on yesterday, I guess, is the threshold being met. Do you think, I mean, looking at the report itself, though, Andrew, do you sort of accept the concerns that are in there around things like performative shouting and, you know, humiliating of students in that way?
I mean, I think those are things that are wrong. I just don't think they were on a par with the death of a child, or a teacher being convicted as a sex offender, or the usual circumstances in which these safeguarding reviews take place. I've repeatedly asked Jim Gamble online, could he name another local child safeguarding practice review that used a similar methodology, and I've not, as far as I know, he couldn't. Beyond that, I think we're dealing with a situation where schools are rarely inspected in that way, because there are all these other ways of holding schools to account without introducing a new one. And I know, you know, there's legally ways of pushing it to say, well, maltreatment, perhaps that includes shouting, abuse, perhaps that includes shouting, but it's not even how abuse is meant to be inspected. It's so irregular that even, as I say, even if the school did things really wrong, you have to ask yourself, is this the correct process? And even if we say accept the school's completely at fault, if the process is used in such an irregular way, what about the next school it's used against?
But shouldn't highly sort of big, you know, highly powerful, high performing schools and academy chains still face external scrutiny?
Well, who's arguing against external scrutiny? It's the unusual nature of the scrutiny that seems problematic. The use of a procedure that's not usually used for that, and I don't think it's ever been used like that. The fact that procedure does not involve due process, it didn't involve investigating the individual complaints one by one and seeing if they were true or false, that it did raise things that there are other ways to report, other systems, other mechanisms. It seemed like an extension of the power of the safeguarding body into areas where you wouldn't expect it to have any involvement.
This is
and
what,
as I say, even if the school deserved it, even if the school had it coming, what if that power is then used against other schools? It doesn't. They don't. Where's the scrutiny of the scrutinizers in this case?
But couldn't you say that with any safeguarding review?
Well, the normal situation of a safeguarding review is not to investigate the allegations. In fact, as I say, it's usually often said that it's not an investigation or an inquiry. They've gone in saying they will substantiate the accusations. Then they've used a different definition to what I would expect by substantiate. When the school objected, they told the school that none of the concerns indicated a child was at risk of suffering significant harm, nor did they require immediate action regarding any member of staff. And yet they put out a report that suggests, I would say, both those things by any reasonable interpretation.
But wouldn't it be fair to also say that safeguarding inquiries rarely work on courtroom standards of proof?
It's not just that it's not a courtroom standard. It's just there is no due process in it. I mean, I don't object to balance of evidence on individual complaints, but they didn't even consider the individual complaints. They said that was not their task. They were investigating themes.
But they did collect testimony, didn't they, of individuals that were listed in the report of sort of things that they said had happened to them. So there was testimony in there of individual, experiences of people within that school, both staff and students.
Well, to what extent did they collect the testimony themselves? I mean, part of the background to this is that there was one parent who, or at least this is according to the school's own internal review, there was one parent that coordinated complaints. He put up, maybe I shouldn't say he did, but somebody put up posters advertising a website to make complaints. The original parents then became part of this group, Educating Hackney, which had links to the independent socialist group on the council, who also claimed responsibility for setting up this organisation. They then harvested hundreds of these complaints. Most of them, the review said, weren't actually relevant, but they narrowed that down to 73 over 5 years, I believe. Yeah. Now, maybe some of them are credible, but 73 complaints about incidents over 5 years is not unprecedented for a big school, in my experience. And if they are credible, if any of those are credible, they should be investigated in their own right, not put together in several themes, quoted without evidence other than testimony, and then used to criticize a school by a body that's not meant to be holding schools to account.
So off the back of what Andrew's just said there, when I was on the show last week, I think because I live in Newham, literally like an adjacent borough, I know a lot of teachers in different schools, including at Mossbourne Victoria Park, and also, was just generally aware of what was going on, no parents with children there, etc. And I think that a lot of what had really bothered me when this story first broke at the end of last year was this feeling that I had where, which is why I've made, a lot of comments about class issues, etc. But I had an issue with what I saw as a lot of when a middle class, or when some middle class families have complaints, a feeling or just a sentiment that in East London, including in Hackney, that it would be taken more seriously than any other group of parents or families, children, whatever. And so a lot of my comments were aimed at that. I also don't know if I should say this, but I think also having heard from, parents in Hackney, I won't like make it specific about anybody, but like I was aware as well that, you know, at least one of the parents who was kind of a catalyst for this initially had taken their child out of the school anyway and sent them to private school. And for me, it just kind of added to my feeling that these aren't people who really had the same stakes or like motivations for, like, I just felt like it was just a clear example of like cancel culture. Like a lot of my view stems from that. But I would also say, listening to the review yesterday, listening to the comments of Jim Gamble yesterday, I personally found really insightful. I think when it comes to this 73 complaints, I don't think it's because they were the only complaints. I think it's like over the 5-year period. I just feel like it's the ones that they had, but I do still kind of query why it was able to come through that website.
When you say come through the website, what do you mean?
Educating Hackney website, where like it was one parent, you know, who initially went to the Observer, and then of course gathered a lot of other testimonies. And then at the same time, like it was interesting listening to Jim Gamble yesterday, because he gave me a perspective that I was just kind of missing, you know, what they were kind of doing and trying to work with the school, and that this had actually started earlier. And so those things were kind of running concurrently. And then basically it was educating Hackney, to me, just seems like it was utilized as a tool to get responses. Like it was just a way of reaching out to parents. And I think they did try. I mean, I would say that when it comes to that part specifically, I mean, maybe they were trying to be fair by having a cutoff point for 5 years and only using things that they found relevant to what they were trying to recommend or make as recommendations out of the review. But I don't know. I
mean, the timeline is a bit confusing because there were 2 different dossiers of complaints. Yeah. So there was this one, I think 20 or 30 complaints organised by this parent at one point. That was enough to get it into the media. And then later on, there was this website that, as I say, the school claimed was that same parent's work that got far more and got, you know, involved going back years, and it involved other schools in the same federation. And working out at what point the safeguarding partnership got involved, I'm not entirely clear. And obviously, I think the original complaints went to the council as well. However, that long process still seems, in the school's account, to have been driven by one parent. And it's clear that some of the people involved were very politically motivated.
I mean, is there a line, though, between having political views and being politically motivated? You know, most people who do these things will have, you know, some will have strong political views, and you trust that they will put those to one side and do things in a fair and accurate way. And isn't that the same in like 99% of these things? You know, inquiries, reviews, the people running them are always going to be part of a party, or they might have their own political views, and you're sort of trusting that if somebody's in that position, that they're going to fulfill their duty and do it in an impartial way.
I'm talking about the complainants when I say about the political part of it.
Sorry.
As in the educating Hackney part.
Yes. Generally. Yeah. I mean, it's there's a political group with councillors claiming responsibility for having set up the site. Now, I realise that the school is saying it's this parent, and that the 2 are not mutually exclusive. But if there's a political campaign group, particularly one that perhaps objects to academies on principle, it does make you wonder. But you know, how can we talk about the safeguarding review collecting the evidence when there's that campaign group collecting it? And although it mentions that website and it mentions it's supported by a counsellor, it doesn't really give the same impression that the school's review gave, that this originally started with one person campaigning and it became this big campaigning website. And I've been in contact with a parent who either sent their child or still does send their child, who was reporting that there were just posters up near the school with a scannable code to get to the website, encouraging people to report any grievance they had. And I think, if you've got that scale of a campaign, a website collecting complaints, a national newspaper collecting complaints, posters up encouraging people to collect complaints, and you end up with 73 complaints relevant to the school in the last 5 years, it's not something that most schools would be particularly shocked by, that level of complaints. And it doesn't help if then the people investigating don't apparently have experience of working in tough secondary schools in recent years and know the level of complaints there. The writer of the review, if I've understood correctly from his biography, he was a teacher from 1977 to 1990. Now, the world of schools then and the world of schools now, I mean, even in my time at teaching, and I don't go back to 1990, although it feels like it at times, and it's the level of parental complaints has transformed. I mean, when I started, if a parent phoned up and complained, you could be sat down with the head teacher that day with a discussion and warned that they'd try and talk the parent into not saying it's an official complaint, but you should go along with whatever they say. And then since then, we've had the introduction of email, which immediately massively multiplies all communication. Some schools have messaging systems, so you can get like multiple comments from parents a day. We now have ChatGPT, which means that parents whose own literacy might make it a challenge to do a written complaint can now ask ChatGPT to come up with one. Head school leaders are talking about dealing with a relentless barrage of complaints and the systems not being in place to deal with them. And then we've got someone saying, after a massive campaign, 73 complaints, that's terrible. We need to completely depart from normal safeguarding procedure. Sorry, they're not saying that. That's my interpretation of what they've done, in order to investigate immediately. And I think, as I say, even if this school is the worst school in the world, the school down the road might be next that's done nothing wrong, and one disgruntled parent could probably get 73 complaints if they were willing to put that kind of effort in and had a political campaign group behind them. I think it comes down to the process. Is this a process you want schools to be judged by or not?
I mean, a few things that our fellow TTR host, Tony, has said recently. I mean, he wrote a bit of a little bit of a list, and he basically said, the things I'm wondering are, 1, they paid lawyers with what money? 2, they quickly reversed the so-called desking policy. 3, they took a long time to provide the requested data. And then he said, why did they not engage with the process at an earlier stage before it got to the point of the review being completed? And 2, release a statement accepting at least some of the concerns and agreeing to listen and adjust policy going forward. Any thoughts on that, Andrew, on his comments there? I
mean, I don't want to defend the school because their own review found fault with some of the things they did. However, I don't criticise them for bringing in their lawyers, and I don't criticise them for being wary of what was going on. I mean, part of the background to this is the child queue report that was also Hackney, also produced by the same body. And so I don't know if I need to recap the case, the illegal strip search of a child in a school by the police. And the original report of that put most responsibility onto the police, but criticised the school for not challenging the police. But then there was a follow-up report which had several pages that were going on about, some schools, and no hint given that it was the school involved in the child queue case, but that some schools in Hackney are too strict, and complaints about schools being too strict. And if you read that review, it seems like somebody's got a thing about strict schools. And I would, having read that, it's hard to then think the same body wanting to get involved, you'd immediately in a school that's having complaints about the rules being strict. You can see a school thinking, I don't know what's going on here, but I can't trust this to be something, this to be completely fair. And particularly when it's not a body that's meant to be investigating schools. And any number of the complaints raised, there are there are other bodies that are meant to investigate, or complaints are meant to go to.
So it said on page 10 of the review, I read it again this weekend. It says the review finds concerns raised about practices like shouting, public humiliation, and a lack of reasonable adjustments can be substantiated. Did it say to, did Jim yesterday say how they were substantiated? I can't remember. And also, what are you guys' thoughts on that?
Well, the review, as I say, it has its own definition of substantiating, which doesn't involve proving or disproving the accusations. And they did, because the school was worried about this, they told the school that none of the concerns indicated a child was at risk of suffering significant harm, and that there was no immediate action required regarding any member of staff. And then they went in and, took on this very unusual review, and then absolutely made those same sort of claims that they said they weren't even really going to try and investigate, and it wasn't needed. So they implied to the school that it wasn't an urgent safeguarding emergency. They justified the review by saying it was a serious safeguarding incident. They didn't use the due process, and things like the SEND issue. There are tribunals that complaints can go to. There is a mechanism in place, and that is not normally considered part of the safeguarding system to look at discrimination claims. And yet they brought in several, more than one discrimination claim, as if that was under safeguarding. It just seems so irregular that you have to ask about what, how can the school survive it?
The tribunals comment, do you mean as in parents with who wanted to raise issues or felt like their children weren't getting reasonable adjustments could have gone to tribunals, or are you saying that?
I mean, there's a whole procedure that leads up to tribunals for complaints about disability discrimination. I'm not a school leader. It's not an area of my expertise, but it's not usually something you report to the safeguarding partnership, as my understanding. And it's certainly not something that I thought they investigated.
I mean, it comes back again, I guess, to, we've talked a lot about the sort of why the review was done, and, the thresholds being met or not being met, or whatever the thresholds were. But to focus for a minute on the actual, the content of the report and the actual submissions that they got, whether we or you or anybody else believes that the process with which these testimonials was collected was politically motivated. The testimonials were collected, and obviously they're in the report, and there's quite a lot of them. Again, we can put 73. The context on. Sure, we can put the context on that and say there were 73 versus the number of students in the school. I think I raised to Jim as well yesterday about the comparatives between different schools in London, for example, or even in Hackney, and sort of the results that they get or got in various surveys and stuff like that. And he made the point, well, yeah, that's fine, but he was saying, yes, we can compare all day, but let's focus on this particular school. I guess his argument would be like in a class where somebody says, but he was talking over there 5 minutes ago, and you're giving me a detention for talking, but you didn't give him one. Right. And you say to the student, no, I'm focusing on your behavior right now, not Jim at the back of the room. It's your behavior we're focusing on. So that's irrelevant. That, I think, was Jim's point. I like
that point, though, because I feel like
my point, paraphrasing his point.
Yeah. Yes. When I was here last week, I was I was so focused on how the process in how the review started, which I just had a lot of, views on, that I just kind of I didn't even really get to mention in the review. And I can't remember exactly what I said last week, but I was kind of thinking a lot of my argument was, well, a lot of schools are really similar. A lot of a lot of the hallmarks of the highest performing schools, which have, you know, transformed the lives of a lot of children, you know, in terms of outcomes and their life chances, have a lot of similar policies. And this is what had been pushed and supported and even praised by the Prime Minister in certain cases. You know, that's what had been happening over the past many years now. And so what is different about Mossbourne? Like, I felt very much like, you know, Mossbourne were being singled out. But when Jim said that, funnily enough, I was thinking, well, actually, like, it does in some way kind of miss the point, you know, like, I mean,
it's possible that both points are valid.
It's
possible that Jim's point is valid. It's also possible to say my points, which were, what about the comparisons?
Yes,
okay?
This is the thing.
Both points can be valid.
I think this, for me, like, I feel like the school has just kind of become the face of so many, like, inextricably linked factors in education. And, you know, if people have different viewpoints or are talking about different parts of this, because there are so many factors at play, I don't think it necessarily makes you wrong. It just means that you're talking about one part, you know, and I think what happens a lot of the time is you will, you know, go into detail about one thing, and then people will like flip it and say, well, this is what you mean. My comments, like, for example, last week on middle class families, as somebody who lives in East London, as someone who's a governor of, you know, a top performing school in East London, as someone who teaches in East London, like, a lot of my views were like shaped by the experiences I have, the things that I see, etc. And just because I'd commented on, you know, class dynamics doesn't mean that I was saying that poor children deserve to be mistreated, or, you know, or deserve to not have anyone advocate for them in school. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're not, it's not just because you've mentioned one point, it doesn't necessarily mean that you believe the other.
I mean, I think with the comparisons, it's if the person reviewing hasn't taught since 1990, and which, as I say, as far as I can tell, that's the case, and there is no comparison with other schools, and it's in, you then have to say, like, how do you judge, at least on some of the content of the review? I mean, I realise that, you know, some things might be unacceptable regardless, but, you know, the level of complaints, some of the statistics, some of the procedures, you have to think, is it going for that school on things that most people would think was normal? And of course, it doesn't make it right if it's normal for other schools. So, you know, in that respect, if that school's bad, but those other schools are bad, it doesn't get them off the hook. But you have to start wondering then whether it is a single school issue that should be, or even a safeguarding issue, or a national policy issue, or a local policy issue. And a safeguarding body should not be solving a political question. If your view is this sort of discipline should not be allowed, or a particular sort of discipline should not be allowed, that's a political cause that you can argue and look for a change of government policy. It's not a reason to just pick one school and go in there and criticise them for doing things that are fairly common. I think safeguarding is not meant to be a political process.
I'm just going to stop you there. On the fairly common, let's read a few statements from this that were handed into this review. And we're not commenting on whether these statements are, you know, we can't comment on the validity of the statements. We can only read the statements, okay? The statements that were submitted. I observed frequent instances where pupils were screamed at for minor infractions, fostering an oppressive environment that was deeply harmful to their well-being. A white female teacher started to scream at a male pupil. I heard the shouting in a playground that was full of pupils and all staff, and was horrified to the extent that I complained to my line manager in the SLT. The senior leadership team would regularly shout into children's faces. Other teachers didn't do this, and I refused to do it myself. I remember a senior teacher getting down to a child's level and screaming at them. Children would be screamed at for turning to look at a clock, or for taking a pen from a bag without asking. In a Year 7 assembly in the first week of term, I witnessed 2 or 3 pupils fainting in line as a result of being screamed at.
Well, can I stop you there?
And so on.
So that story of children fainting, does that not sound like something that cannot be, that someone who works in a school might know that seems extremely unlikely. I mean, I don't want to just appeal to context. Like, if everything that's said about the school in the report was true, then that's a terrible school. But
wouldn't you
aren't you sceptical and shouldn't there be due process?
Wouldn't you have said that seemed unlikely?
About
that
was verified.
Safeguarding cases that have been proven to be,
that was investigated. Child Q was investigated.
If you'd have said that happened in advance, but it was unlikely it would have happened, people would have gone, that wouldn't have happened, but it did happen. And
we know, but it was investigated. The point I'm getting at is the truth of the claim
this was investigated.
Of that fainting case. The truth of it was not investigated. Nobody went and said, right, we know that on this date, children fainted. Can we speak to the people who witnessed it? That kind of thing did not happen. Unlike
the shouting. There's a lot of different testimony, I guess, on the shouting and shouting in students' faces and shouting really loudly and everything. Now, listen, this isn't me saying that we can debate, as we've done so far, the evidence and the credibility of the evidence and the evidence behind the evidence. We can so I think that's a fair debate. But if we just say for a second, there were 73 complaints and a whole bunch of them were about shouting in children's faces and teachers being told to, instill a culture of healthy fear and all this sort of thing, imagining that some of that, has a basis. In fact, that's, I would say to you, Andrew, is that like every other school? Because you're saying lots of other schools do that. Is that like every other school?
I'm not saying the content of the complaints is like every school. I'm saying the making of complaints is like other schools. It's certainly not rare for a teacher to be accused of shouting.
The content of those reports isn't like a lot of other schools.
Well, I think that the complaints some schools get are extreme, and often, they're not credible. It's the lack of an attempt to confirm that's an issue. If we just say, look at the most hideous complaints, that means we can now use safeguarding as a way to judge a school without any due process. That's a problem. And we mentioned Child Q. There was another very similar complaint made a few weeks after that got reported on national news, and no action ever got taken because after it was investigated, it turned out not to be true, or as far as the police could tell, the accusation was not true. I think it just comes down to, do we start with what's the worst thing the school's been accused of?
Sorry, Andrew. I think the reason I raised that was because you were saying the idea of the children fainting seems ridiculous to any teacher. I was just making the point that.
Yeah, I'm not saying it shouldn't be investigated. I'm saying it should have been investigated.
Yeah, all I'm doing is focusing on your point, which you said was most teachers would find that ridiculous that would happen. And the only point I was trying to make was that I guess the basis of a lot of safeguarding, any sort of safeguarding review is, that probably didn't happen. Do you know what I mean? That could have been the reaction of anybody in any number of.
Isn't the whole point of safeguarding that you always believe, isn't good safeguarding that you always believe something could happen somewhere or there or here? I'm sure you know what I'm saying.
Yes, and you investigate. It's the fact that this was not a normal safeguarding investigation. It was a particular type of review that's meant to happen alongside investigations that other authorities say it isn't an investigation. It's this really weird method, really odd type of review, and it keeps being justified by, well, look how bad the accusations were, and rather than, are the accusations true? Why are we not finding that out? Why are we trying to ascertain whether they're true or not in this weird method? And as I say, I don't want to say you ignore complaints because they're implausible, but I do say you don't publish complaints with no proper investigation when you know they're implausible. I might also add that some of the stuff in there, you have to wonder what was going on. They there's comments there on a complaint not being pursued when a child complained a teacher wouldn't open a window. I mean, how, again, if you, as a teacher, is it a reasonable complaint that the school should investigate when you don't make the decision to open a window and a child thinks you should have? And yet that got in there. It's the lack of a filter that I think is a result of a lack of any reasonable process.
But they said that the rationale for the review was the volume and the detail of the complaints. And I guess they are kind of on a sliding scale. Like, yes, on the one hand, there maybe are some complaints, like you've mentioned, about a window that, like we all know that, schools, the number of complaints that they're getting are massively increasing. A lot of the time, there isn't much of a basis to them, or they might be a normal part of school life. But then on the other hand, there were parts of this that said, that highlighted, say, particular groups, like I think it was Black boys and SEND pupils, who were highlighted as, or kind of identified as, experiencing discrimination, which was also part of their complaint. So are we putting these complaints on, like a sort of sliding scale? I think the rationale for the review, and also one other thing I wanted to say though, I think when I was reading the rationale part, what was his name again? Was it Sir Alan Wood? I think one thing I wanted to say, just I didn't get a chance to earlier, Andrew, is personally, like, I don't feel like how long he was a teacher is really relevant. Like,
well, it's not a matter of the length of time, it's how long ago it was. If I would not be shocked to discover a school had 73 written complaints collected, referring to incidents over 5 years. He did seem shocked because he commented on the volume.
But
I would also add that I'm not aware, unless something's changed, that discrimination cases are meant to be dealt with by safeguarding practice review bodies.
Pause, guys. We're going to continue in 1 second. Let me just say a massive appreciation shout out to Hachette Learning, who are our supporters and sponsors on the show this morning on Points of View. This show is brought to you by Hachette Learning, partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources for schools around the world. If you are looking for your holiday book order, then head over to the Hachette Learning website, Hachette Learning. Just Google that, head over there and make an order. There you go. Carry on. What were you saying, Yasmin?
But I think I'll refer to like my personal experiences again as somebody who has had a disability discrimination tribunal. And I can hands down say that is like the worst experience of my life, maybe even worse than the discrimination itself. Like, it was so hard, like it ruined my life. It took years for me to like recover my health. It had an impact on like every area of my life. And I'm very acutely aware that when someone has a disability, even as an adult, like I think what helped me at the time, like I had a lot of trouble with the union as well, but what helped me was being able to watch YouTube tutorials and kind of teach myself employment law and stuff about the Equality Act, which I didn't know anything about it before I was diagnosed with MS. And I just think for me, it's almost like, I don't know, it's like it's almost like absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence kind of thing when it comes to tribunals. Like, I just can't imagine a lot of families would be able to go through a process like that.
Yeah, but if the system as it stands is flawed, it doesn't mean people with particular responsibilities can just take on or invent a new system. I mean, I don't want to say everything is perfect, not about the school or about the system or about inspection. What I do want is, if someone's saying, right, we now need to review schools in this different way, that there should be a debate over it, that we don't confuse safeguarding questions with political questions. We don't confuse questions of process with an attitude of, well, as long as we get the right conclusion, we can use any process that has a completely different purpose.
Another thing I just kind of wanted to put out there is I heard that Mossbourne Victoria Park Academy actually have the highest P8 for SEND pupils in, like, I don't
I think they were seventh. I think they were seventh in Progress 8 or something. Maybe last year or the year before in the country nationally. I think.
Oh yeah, I was about to say
it was seventh. I don't know about SEN.
No, I think their SEND data, because this information for me came from somebody who's actually at the school. I don't actually know. I can't like verify how like accurate that is. That is what a teacher told me. But you know, in the report, I did see a mix. Like the report literally identified itself. It said that, you know, responses to surveys were polarized. You know, there were some people who had some serious complaints, and then there were other people, in fact I think it was the overwhelming majority, were in massive support of the school and felt like it was doing great things for their kids. And I think that would probably kind of be normal in, I think that happens in a lot of schools, that, you know, you will get a range of responses. But, you know, there were examples there mentioned of SEND adjustments that had been done swiftly, and, you know, children that had been supported. But at the same time, if you've got even one child who isn't, like, isn't that one too many?
I mean, I think this is where the need for a baseline has to come in, because there were always going to be some dissatisfied parents. I mean, I'd love to think there's a school, a secondary school in a challenging area, where every single parent was 100% happy. But I don't want to go from there's one child whose parents feel they haven't had the reasonable adjustment they want, to we can investigate the school and condemn it in the strongest terms.
Do you think that the way, though, that I mean it's well and good saying let's not have, you know, this sort of review, this type of review, but I guess one of their arguments would be that the complaint system, the complaints hearing system, as in emails being answered and, you know, complaints being addressed and all the rest of it, they would argue that wasn't happening in the school. And would there be an argument that, you know, should we hold high achieving schools to a higher, not lower standard when it comes to pastoral standards or pastoral care?
I'm sort of cynical about the people wanting to target the highest achieving schools in an area, because I can imagine that if you're a local authority and there's an academy chain having incredible results and your schools are not as impressive, you've got every incentive to like, well, maybe we should hold them to a higher standard than these other schools. I think schools have to be held to the same standards.
Do you think, though, that the sort of success narrative that we've sort of just discussed around MVPA, sort of, there's a danger that sort of silences, you know, experiences that don't fit into that narrative?
I think
it's so successful academically.
I think it's worth discussing. I don't think the school should be beyond criticism and normal scrutiny. It's the unusual scrutiny and the unusual, sorry, I shouldn't say unusual criticisms, because that makes it sound the fact they're rare means they're not important, but the bizarre criticisms, the ones that you'd think, well, I'd really like to see the evidence for that. That's what I would challenge.
Do you accept, though, that some parents might not feel confident challenging large academy chains and teachers, actually, for that matter? But you know, we're talking in this context about parents, families. Do you think there's a worrying power dynamic?
I think that's a reasonable area of policy to review, and the school did review its complaints procedure and found that it wasn't not the school, the federation did review its complaints procedure. As I say, I'm not trying to give, you know, the school a clean bill of health. I mean, just researching this, there were things that if I was the kind of person to criticize individual schools in public, then maybe I would criticize. My worry, though, is that if silly criticisms are seen in print, if irregular reviews are being held to hold schools to account under very odd circumstances, it's just piling up the stress on schools, good or bad. It would be lovely if we could just say, well, if the teachers at your school are the perfect models of compassion, then you will not be subject to complaints, and you could never be subject to a strange investigation using odd methods. I think it's just, if you're going to scrutinise schools this closely, then the process of scrutiny needs to be scrutinised this closely as well.
But maybe this is going to be a new way of scrutinising schools, because maybe what is expected of high-performing schools is now going to change.
I would say it would be an interesting policy decision, but it's not for the Safeguarding Partnership in one local authority in the country to suddenly decide, here's the new process for holding schools to account.
Oh no, I don't think that's even their aim, to be honest. But I just think, considering how high profile this has been, it's everywhere, I think that I think they just tried to do what they could for their local authority. But I don't know. I just think maybe this is going to be a new way in which, schools are now going to get scrutinized, because I think a lot of people, there are so many reports even this year that have come out about all kinds of things, lost learning, and how exclusion is on a continuum, and how things like behavior improvement rooms or being removed from class are all forms of exclusion on a scale. And obviously I think both of you don't necessarily agree with me on this, but as Tom would know, on very many shows, I have very strong feelings about the way that, say, a permanent exclusion causes the life chances of children to plummet. And that's not to say that exclusions shouldn't exist. In the current system that we have, I think there are many cases where they're completely necessary, but that's just kind of yeah, go on.
Well, I'm sure I do have differing opinions, but I welcome the chance to debate them. My issue here on the Safeguarding Review is that's not open public political debate. In fact, they've several times said that no one should be challenging the review, that it's meant to be the last word on what I think is a policy question. And I would say, exclusions is definitely a political question and a policy question.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying, but to just finish the point I was trying to make before I went on a bit of a tangent, I just think a lot of that there's more recognition for the children that kind of fall through the gaps, I feel, in high performing schools. And so my view just is that this is something that's going to start to happen more, as in a review like this. I think maybe this one is kind of unprecedented or novel, and they did say that the rationale for it was the maltreatment and, as I said earlier, the detail and the number of complaints that they got. But I just think, how I see it now, if in another local authority or in another school in the same place, if enough parents are to gather their responses or their feedback, I just think moving forward, I don't see how this wouldn't happen to more high performing schools.
Oh, yeah.
Is that a good or bad thing, though, Yasmin? Is that a good or bad thing? My thing with this is, I think you've both raised some really good points about, what is the trajectory forward? Does this lead to a new approach to sort of how complaints are processed, or, what happens when a group of parents feel that, they're not happy with whatever a school is doing? So I suppose my sort of worry, which is separate, it's separate from this really, is what happens next around the country, I guess, in terms of, we already know there is this complaint crisis in inverted commas, as in, teachers and schools can't deal with the number of complaints and, the use of AI to generate the complaints and all the rest of it. So I suppose, what happens next after this?
To answer your question, Tom, to answer your question, I would say it's a good thing, but with like caveats or whatever. I just feel yes, generally I would say it's a good thing. But for me, especially in, a trial by media era, there has to be acknowledgement of the fact that not every complaint, like some complaints are vexatious, or some campaigns against the school can be vexatious or be done, in bad faith. And another thing I would also say is, I feel like the weight of complaints, you can't put families on a sliding scale. A complaint from everyone has to come equal, like it has to be considered equal. I think there was even a point in the report that mentioned, I think it was maybe a testimony from a teacher that said it said white middle class children were taken more seriously than black working class children. And like that's more than one, like variable. That's mentioning class and race at the same time. Like there's just a lot of things overlapping there. But I mean, even if you look at this Mossbourne thing, I feel like, some parents who, like the one who first went to the Observer, I feel like sometimes when a parent raises a complaint or leverages the media, they're seen as bettering the world. And then you've got other parents, like even if you compare it to the complaints about Mossbourne in Tilbury, you've got, parents who might be a different demographic who get maligned and are seen as, just not being able to put up with school rules. And so for me, it's a thing of all families, if something is going to be raised about a school, then everything has to be considered fairly and equally, and at the same time the same has to happen for the school, if that makes sense. But I do also think, since this has happened now, even though I do still have some of the same feelings that, I do feel like the school was, I said last time blindsided, but having listened to Jim Gamble, I know they weren't. But like, I guess maybe it's because it's novel or because it's new. I don't know what it is about this. Like something about this just seems like it put the school kind of on the back foot. But I forgot what I was going to say.
So the
last thing I was going to say, sorry. I think for Mossbourne to just say, to just acknowledge what has happened, it says that a lot of the stuff has been substantiated. I think to just say, moving forward, this is what's going to be done for our school community. Personally, I just think it would go a long way now.
Well, the school did its own internal review that did have findings that their complaints procedure wasn't right, and it did make recommendations that hopefully will be followed. I mean, this is why I think it can be a mistake to focus on that one individual school rather than what happens next. I think
Yasmin's point though there was about the response from the school. Would the response from the school be best to say, we acknowledge this has happened, not as in what happened in the report happened. We acknowledge the report has happened. We acknowledge that there are some issues which were mirrored in our internal investigation that need to be addressed, complaints. They may also say, no, there's a few things in the report that we will internally review. We're now going to move forward. They don't need to actually say, we accept all the findings of the report. Mm-hmm. But I think Yasmin's point is, there's been scrutiny. Whether you think it's fair or not, it's out there, it's done. Yeah. So now is it their job, their role, if you like, to say, okay, we don't acknowledge everything in it. We think that it's unfair, but we need as an organization to look at what it says and actually go, okay, we know the truth because we're in it. Right? I mean, they know whether it's true or false because they're the ones in it. We don't. And actually, you could argue, which you have, Andrew, that the people doing the review might not have known that either, right? But fundamentally, they know because they're in it.
Yeah, like I'm not going to pretend I don't understand like Mossbourne's defensiveness in this. Like I'm absolutely not going to pretend like, I was like really passionate about this last week, but at the same time, I just think if it's really about the kids, just like take it on the chin and just make it about the kids by putting something out and responding to the review.
I mean, we have to remember that this is being dealt with by a trust that has other schools.
Yeah.
So they are, they cannot, if they just say, oh yeah, all these criticisms are right, we're going to massively change everything, or even if they're just seen as being craven before an irregular procedure rather than acting on the basis of their own review and their own evidence, they set the precedent for going after all their other schools, which I think it's fair to say a lot of people involved in this would love to do. I think also on the question of things going forward, what's a bit unusual about this is, I think something that's a bit unusual about the Mossbourne Federation as it is how old the central school there is, and how long it's been there, and how long it's been known for being quite strict. That most massive school shamings, so the most campaigns by parents against the school's behaviour policy, don't happen in long established schools, or schools that have had particular rules for 10 years or more, or 20 years in the case of the main academy there. They happen in failing schools that are being turned round. Now, if we do just say a lot of parents being annoyed at strict rules is a problem that everyone must immediately investigate and take seriously, I think it would have huge implications for people trying to turn around failing schools where discipline has been poor and trying to improve discipline. I mean, my experience is that this is unusual in as much as they were complaining about long established aspects of what the school did, and they got complaints going back years, whereas I can imagine similar situations where schools introduce a new policy and we get the same sort of campaign, and then we have the question of is that going to now become a safeguarding issue too? It certainly makes things very insecure for schools trying to have a good standard of discipline if parental complaints alone are seen as something that should be accepted and counted without any scrutiny of where they came from, who organised them, are they true?
I think we've run out of time. Andrew, it was great having you on. Thank you so much for giving up your time to come on and say your piece on this. I think it's a really important issue, very interesting as well. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you everybody who has tuned in this morning as well and has watched this. It'll be available obviously on YouTube if you want to watch it back. And we'll also publish it as a podcast soon in the next few days. And this will be our last show of the holiday season. Teachers, say again, Yasmin? Not ever. Probably. No, it won't be. We'll be back. But yeah, our last show of the holiday season. So we'll be back, I think, on the 4th of January or 3rd of January. I can't remember. It's one of the two. But we'll be back in about a week, and have a great break, everybody. Have a wonderful holiday season and a great Christmas if you're celebrating it. And we'll be back soon. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everybody watching. Thank you, listeners. Thank you everybody who has watched and listened this whole year. It's been great. So thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers